Of people around the world enjoy a hot cup of joe every day. But why do we all love this weird, bitter taste? In theory, humans should not enjoy the taste of coffee because we're born with a natural reflex to reject bitterness. We think this is because bitterness is generally an indication of poison. So if coffee reminds us of poison, why do we drink it? One theory is that people consume bitter foods when it provides some kind of pharmacological benefit. And one benefit, it wakes us up with a good dose of caffeine. Caffeine is a powerful drug that not only gives you that jolt of energy, but it's also been linked to improving overall cognitive function. When the positive feeling we receive from drinking coffee outweighs the rejection of the bitterness, our bodies seem to be more willing to accept the flavor. But this isn't true of everyone. Research has found that some people may taste the chemicals that produce a bitter flavor more intensely than others. People whose receptors are less active than others may have a better chance of accepting the taste of coffee. So, if you enjoy coffee, you're working against nature telling you you shouldn't. But that kind of makes you want it more, now doesn't it?
So now you know why we serve you coffee on Sunday mornings. I've realized that I started drinking coffee in college out of necessities to stay awake, working full-time and going to school full-time, and that required some coffee, but I learned the secret. See, the secret is you gotta drink half and half flavored creamer, half coffee. You know, that's the way I like it. I like my coffee to taste like ice cream. After going to India, I can't have like a lot of caffeine anymore, so now I drink decaf coffee. I still like it because it tastes like ice cream. So that's the way you deal with that bitterness. But either way, you're like, what does this have to do with anything? And that really doesn't. We are going to be in a new series titled Deeper Than a Coffee Cup. And so the idea in this series is that we all have these coffee mugs at home. Maybe not all of us, but a lot of Christians have these coffee mugs at home, and they have Bible verses on them. They have Christian sayings on them, and so I'll show you one. This is like a unisex one, and it's very classy. It says, "I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me." Philippians 4:13. So many of you may actually have a mug that says that on it at your house, and maybe it doesn't look like that. Maybe it's a little girly, and this is Katie's, and it's all flowery. This is from our cabinet, and it says, "I can do all things through Christ." You know, they cut off the end, but either way, it's there. But what I'm trying to do in this series is help us to see the richness of the Bible. Because what happens when we look in these verses and they're on coffee cups, a lot of times we actually only get like half a verse, and they sound really good. So you don't get certain verses on coffee mugs. You don't get there'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth on a coffee mug, right? You only get these verses that sound really good, and a lot of times what we think they mean when we read them, if all we do is read a verse on a coffee mug, we actually a lot of times don't get it right. It means what we want it to mean, and that actually isn't helpful. So if we look at it in the Bible and the verses around it, we learn some more. I considered titling this series "Skin Deep" to deal with the tattoo trend, where Christians get Bible verses and Bible references tattooed on them. And see, my thing is, if you're going to get a Bible verse tattooed on you, like, that's great. You're going to deal with the pain. But listen, you should study it first. Like, don't just get it because it sounds good. Right, Steph Curry, all this stuff, Steph Curry plays for the Warriors. It says, "I can do all things," right? He may know what it means, but all these things, they say, "I can do all things." Well, yeah, what does that mean? Doesn't even say anything about Christ. So if you're going to get something on you, like let's take a little time, let's think about it. And some of you are like, "Why are we talking about tattoos in church?" Welcome to Bethany, where we are not afraid to talk about some things that make some Christians uncomfortable. But we are going to be looking at this verse today, Philippians 4:13, and like I said, you can't just look at this one verse and get what we want to get out of it. We're going to look at the verses around it and see what it means. But this is a verse that, football season starts, well, it started Thursday, but it really starts today. And so, Eagles fans, by the way. Sorry, that's a David Jackson reference. Football season starts today, and there's a pretty famous football player, maybe not the most talented, but a very famous, named Tim Tebow. And this was one of his favorite verses. And so on the cover of Sports Illustrated, it said Philippians 4:13 in his eye black. And some of you may look at that and be like, "Oh, wow, well, maybe he's using like a coffee cup," but he actually wasn't. His senior year of college, he did an interview, and this is what he says about the text. He knew it was deeper than the coffee cup. He says, a lot of people don't interpret that verse the right way. Most people think it means I can do anything on the football field, or I can make a lot of money. But that's not exactly what it's saying, what it's talking about there. It's saying I can be content with anything. So he's pointing us in the right direction, and we're going to look at that. But here's what really bothered me before I even prepared for this sermon. So you got football teams, right? Chances are on every NFL team or any high school team, there's at least one Christian, right? So they're both saying, I can win this game through Christ who strengthens me. Well, what? God's going to play favorites, right? We got to figure out which one God's going to give the strength. He's not going to give it to you, but he's going to give it to you. What, did you read the Bible more this week? What's the deal? Right? So that's not what it's talking about. It's actually, if you're going to put that verse in reference to sports, it actually is, you're using sports to put it on display. Sports is not, you're not talking about, I'm going to go win this game because Christ is strengthening me. No, that's an improper application of this verse. But it could be that God's brought you through some really difficult things and you want the world to know that you are content with wherever he brings you and that's what the verse means. It's not about football at all. But we're going to look at verses 10 to 14, look at the context. And so when we were in James, it was really nice. We could kind of go from verses, we could just go passage to passage, and we looked at the context in the beginning, so it was really easy. But since we're switching books, now we're in Philippians just for this week. Next week we'll be in a different book. I got to give you a little bit of background. So you go turn in your Bible, New Testament, past the Gospels, you get to Philippians. You're like, what's Philippians? Well, Philippians is a letter written by the Apostle Paul to the church at Philippi. Philippi was in Macedonia, and in Paul, in the letter, he's thanking them for their partnership in the gospel. And what I think you need to know is that Paul wrote this when he was in prison. So any interpretation of Philippians 4:13 that doesn't account for you being in prison is invalid. Like, if you can't be in prison and this verse be true, then you don't understand the verse correctly. So we're going to look at it. Some of you are going to be like, well, I don't want that verse tattooed on me anymore. But it is a very, very powerful, meaningful passage that we're going to see today. So let's read it. Philippians 4:10 to 14. It says, I rejoice, that's Paul. Paul rejoiced in the Lord greatly that now at length you have revived your concern for me. You were indeed concerned for me, but you had no opportunity. Not that I am speaking of being in need, for I have learned in whatever situation I am to be content. I know how to be brought low, and I know how to abound. In any and every circumstance, I have learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. Yet it was kind of you to share my trouble. Here's the main idea for today. You can rejoice when others share in your troubles, when you understand that God is your ultimate provider. You understand that God is your ultimate provider. We see this not only in these verses, we see it later. So I'm going to point out one of these verses to you, verse 19. I'll show that to you, and it says, and my God, this is Paul speaking again, will supply every need of yours according to his riches in glory in Christ Jesus. Paul is someone that knew that God was his provider. But I think this brings up an interesting question, especially in America, is what do we really need? You know, if you've been on Facebook this week, you've seen some people that aren't in need making some decisions that show that they're not in need. So if you've seen some people burning a certain brand of tennis shoes because of an ad that they didn't like. So not commenting on that. But if you were in need, you wouldn't be burning your tennis shoes because you wouldn't burn your only pair of tennis shoes, right? So I've seen some pastors post, I didn't do it, I thought it was pretty funny though. I wear a 13. So what I would have posted would have said, hey, if you're burning if you want to burn any of your Nikes, I wear size 13, I'm taking donations. So I thought that was pretty funny. But seriously, if that's what you're doing, I'll take them. But I'm a Cowboys fan, right? Cowboys fan, season starts today. Guess what? It's not on TV. That happens like twice a year. It's the first game of the season, it's not on TV. I feel like I need to go get NFL total access, direct TV, sign up for that $40 a month, because I got to watch this game. That's what I feel like. But do I need it? And all of you are like, no, just become a Ravens fan or something. But I feel that I need that, but it's not a need. But there's so many things in our life that we feel like we need, that we like have emotions about it, but we don't really need. Paul understood the difference between a want or a desire and a need, and he trusted God to meet his needs. Paul was, many of you know this, he was a tent maker. So Paul would make tents to earn an income for himself. We don't believe he was married, so he probably didn't need a huge income, didn't have any kids, but he would make tents, and that would be how he provided for himself. But in jail, you can't make tents anymore, and if you did, they probably just take the money. So either way, Paul was not able to provide for himself. So what he had to learn in prison was, how do I trust God to meet my needs? So in this letter, he's thanking the Philippians for the gift that they give him, and he sees the gift that they gave him as God's provision. Verse 14 says this, says, it was kind of you to share my trouble. He views the gift that is given as God meeting his needs through people. I wanted to look back at verse 10, because I think there's something important that we can learn here. He says, I rejoiced in the Lord greatly that now at length you have revived your concern for me. You were indeed concerned for me, but you had no opportunity. I think we learned something about stewardship here. I think we see something about how Paul viewed people's resources. I believe he believed this, that God gives us opportunities to share what he has given us. God gives us opportunities to share what he has given us. He says, you had no opportunity. So what he's saying is that you guys wanted to support me. You were supporting me. But for some reason, he doesn't tell us the reason, you were not able to support me anymore. So Paul, what is that reason? We don't know, but let's just throw some things out there. Maybe it was that there was an economic depression and the people income went down, so they didn't have enough money to give to outside of their church, so they only could give to their local church because they didn't have a lot of income at the time. Maybe that's the reason. Maybe that's why they didn't have an opportunity, because financially there was a change. Or maybe it was that when he went to prison, they didn't know where he was. And so they didn't have an opportunity to give to him. But he says that you were concerned for me. You wanted to help me. Your heart was in the right place. Your heart was, I want to help this person as he goes and advances the gospel, but you didn't have an opportunity. This church in Philippi was a generous church. They weren't a church that just said, okay, we have this extra money, let's go build this new wing to our building, or let's go hire a new staff just because we can. Or they weren't doing that. They were looking to give to someone that they wanted to give to, and that was Paul. But my question is, what if we, as a church and then individually, adopted Paul's perspective that when we have excess, when we're doing our budget, that we started to look for opportunities to help those in their trouble? What if we started to look at that as an opportunity to give? Instead of looking at, oh, I got a raise at work, or oh, I came into this inheritance money, instead of saying, oh, well, that means now I can get a new car, I can get a bigger house, I can get a new wardrobe. What if instead of thinking that way, we thought, what opportunity is God going to bring across my path so that I can be a blessing to others? Because I believe Paul believed that when God gives some Christians overabundance of resources, that he's blessed those Christians to be a blessing to others, not so that they can just go live a life of luxury. And I think it's important that he says he rejoiced in the Lord. You know, Paul is very clear. It's very interesting what he says. He's very clear that he's not like, if the Philippians didn't give to me, then I'm going to die, then I'm going to starve to death. He says, not that I'm speaking of being in need. Even though he's hungry, he's like, God's going to provide for me. He chose you guys to be the ones to do it, so I'm thanking you for it. But I'm rejoicing in the Lord, because the Lord is the one that prompted you to share with me. And look at verse 11. It says, not that I'm speaking of being in need, for I have learned in whatever situation I am to be content. I think it's very interesting that he says, I'm not speaking of being in need, because he's hungry. Paul's situation for us as Americans would feel very needy. We're in prison. It's not like prison today. We got cable TV and they're giving you all these meals and everything you need. No. Paul relied on people to support him. They're like, listen, he's in jail. If you want to help him, help him. If not, we'll keep him alive. He says, I'm not speaking of being in need. But then in verse 14, he says, it was nice of you to share in my trouble. So for Paul, it's a very interesting thing. He says, I'm not in need, but I'm facing troubles. I'm not going to die, but I'm facing troubles. It was kind of you to share in that with me. But he says he's learned to be content. He's learned to be content. So what does the word content mean? I think it's very important that we define that. I think this is where this whole passage is going to, is this idea of contentment. And the first thing I think I need to say is that contentment is not complacency. Contentment is not complacency because let's say you're a man in this church, you have a family, you got 3 kids, and you lose your job. And so your wife comes to me. She's like, Pastor, I got a problem. My husband lost his job, and he's just sitting on the couch. And he says, when God wants to give him another job, he'll give him another job. He's not looking for a job. He's just sitting there. I want to deal with that right now. Because that's called complacency. That's saying, I'm not going to do anything. I'm just going to trust God to provide, but you're not going to do what you're supposed to do. And so what we have to do whenever we look at Scripture, when you look at your coffee cup verses, you have to interpret Scripture with Scripture. So when Paul says in 1 Timothy 5, verse 8, when he says it's for someone not to provide for those in his own household, that person is worse than an unbeliever. We have to take that and put this idea of contentment together. So contentment does not mean you just sit around and expect God just to meet all of your needs and do nothing. That's not what contentment means. That's called complacency. But the Greek word for content here is only used one time in the entire New Testament. Paul uses the word content. If you look and you just do an English search on the word content, we're going to see the other verses today, but he uses the word content in English 3 times. But he only uses this word here once. And there's a reason for that, and I think it's very important. The word that he uses here means self-sufficient. It's a word that you find in the ancient Greek philosophy called Stoicism. So some of you will identify with this a little bit. So you guys heard of this? You say someone they're very stoic, like as a description of their attributes. So you tell me a joke, and I'm like this. Don't laugh. Don't show any emotion. That's what Stoics do. So very interesting. This is something that Socrates would talk about like 300 years before Jesus was born. But there's still people practicing Stoicism today. I found websites about modern Stoicism, and they have it's like a religion almost, and they practice it. But here's what Stoics believe. Stoics believe that you have everything you need to face life in and of yourself. That you only need to rely on yourself to deal with life. So what the modern Stoics, I'm reading some of their articles, what they say is that when you wake up in the morning, get your journal out and journal every bad thing that could happen that day, that could possibly happen, and then prepare yourself for it. So if it happens, you don't respond emotionally. Stoicism is about emotional detachment. And you have to be like, why would anybody want to be like that? But here's the reason. When Stoicism was founded, it was a time of turmoil. And so they were trying to come up with something apart from a relationship with God that they could cope. And so they came up with this idea that if we just decide that everything that we need we have in ourselves, we don't need anybody, we don't need any God, we don't need anything, we can do it all of ourselves. That's what they came up with. And so they tried to operate in this, and people still today try to operate in this way, and they swear that this is good for them. But this means that when you're in trouble, you don't ever ask God for anything because you don't need God. You only need yourself. So it's a very interesting type of belief. But I think if we use an illustration, this is the best illustration I could find that would deal with this is like when you go camping. So this year, my family got a pop-up camper for free. And how many of you like to go camping, by the way? Like to go camping? How many of you like to go glamping? Anybody else? So I like to go glamping. I gotta just be honest with you. I like air conditioning, and I like comfy mattresses and TV and all that. I just want to be at my house but in the woods. Anyways, we have a pop-up camper. It's one of the smallest Coleman pop-up campers of '97. Someone gave it to us, and so we got it through inspection and everything. So we've taken it out a few times. But last weekend, my family took it to this place on the Eastern Shore, and they took it for the first 2 nights, and then Katie and I and our new puppy. You didn't know I have a new puppy. You'll see pictures in the future sermons. But we were there. We went there Sunday after church. We drove out there, and we stayed in there. And it's really small, doesn't have air conditioning, doesn't have a shower. It has a sink and beds, basically, and some cabinets. And so we're in there. I'm sitting outside, and we're making dinner or something, and to my left is a 30-foot RV, and to my right is a 30-foot RV, and to my right's right is a 30-foot RV, and I'm looking at them, and they are in there, and they got their air conditioning going. It's hot. It's like 95 degrees. And they're in there. The air conditioning's going. They got lamps, couches, TVs. And I'm like, oh, man. That's where I want to be. That's where I want to be. I was comparing myself to them. But here's the thing. If you have an RV like that, you don't need anybody. When I go camping, I need the bathhouse, right? If I want to take a shower, I got to go to the bathhouse because there's no shower in there. And so these guys, they have these big water tanks they can fill up, and then when they're at the campground, they can use electric, but they don't even need it. They can just bring a generator and plug their camper into the generator. They have a hot water heater. They can take showers. They can do everything they need in their camper. They can just pull in the middle of the desert with their stuff, and they can just set up and they can live there. My pop-up camper can't do that. I mean, it could, but it would be very uncomfortable. The people in these gigantic RVs are self-sufficient. They have everything they need within their own ability to meet it for themselves. So when I'm in my pop-up camper, I'm dependent. What Paul is not saying is that he doesn't depend on anyone. But I think it's very important that we consider that he uses the word that the Stoics used for being self-sufficient. He's not saying that he has everything he needs in and of himself. But he's saying, here's where our coffee cup verse comes in. He's saying that with Christ, he can handle anything that comes his way. He has everything that he needs with him in a relationship with Jesus Christ. I have a question. Do you think that Paul could be content if he compared himself to everybody else? So if Paul he's an apostle, and the other apostles, let's say he just compares himself to the church of Philippi. Hey, these guys are advancing the gospel, doing what God called them to do, but they're not in jail. They're able to be married and have a family and have houses and do what they want to do, and I'm in jail. If Paul was comparing himself to them, would he ever find contentment? I don't think so. If I'm at a campground and all I'm doing is looking at 30-foot RVs with air conditioning and TVs and couches and all this nice stuff, am I ever going to be content in my little pop-up camper? No. What happens is when we start comparing ourselves, we fall into a comparison trap, and we can never be content. Our focus gets off. Instead of saying, God, thank you for providing this pop-up camper, we say, God, why didn't you provide me with that 30-foot RV like those people? God, instead of giving me the job that you gave me or the house that you gave me or the spouse that you gave me, how come you didn't give me those people's house, job, spouse? How come you didn't give me those things? Our focus is off, and we don't thank God because we are only thinking about what God didn't give us instead of what he has given us. And what we're going to find is that God's given us much more than he promises to give us. But most people think that contentment is based on their circumstances. If I only had more money, if I only won the lottery, if I only got this promotion, then I'll be content. I used to say when I was working for the government, I started at the state of Maryland. I worked for the Office of Legislative Audits. I was an auditor at 22. My plan was to start there at 22, retire at 52. And I told you guys this before, but moving to the country, I wanted a big land. I wanted a 15-car garage with 15 cars in it. Then I'll be content. So I said. But there's no way I would have been content. Because I'm telling you, I got 15 cars, and then I'm going to find another car I want. And I might sell one of the cars, or I might just have to get another garage and start filling that one. Because that's how it works. More money never was going to lead to contentment. Contentment doesn't come by having more things or more money. Contentment is a heart issue that you have to deal with God. Second thing I want you to see today is that contentment is not natural. It must be learned. Paul says he learned the secret to being content, we're going to see in the next verse. Paul wasn't born being content. We are all born being discontent. And if you're an American, you are born being super discontent. Look at verse 12. He says, I know how to be brought low, and I know how to abound. In any and every circumstance, I have learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need. And Paul is saying he learned this through experience, through going through these hard times in life. He's gone through things that I hopefully, prayerfully will never go through, but he learned contentment through those things. And so Paul could identify with someone who could only afford ramen noodles for 59 cents from Walmart for their meal for a whole week, or he could identify with someone who abounded and who could take their wife on a date whenever they wanted to into a nice restaurant. He could identify with a single parent, and he could identify with someone that had an overabundance of what they needed. He probably couldn't identify with a millionaire Because when we start thinking about prosperity in America, Paul says he had plenty, which means more than I needed. Paul, the level of luxury that some people live in America would be foreign to Paul. But he's not saying that you can't be content, even if that's what God has provided you. I'm just throwing that out there. That Paul would not. He would not be thinking about someone that has millions of dollars in what he's talking about here. But he says he learned the secret, and I think it's very telling that he calls it a secret, because it sure seems like a secret. Because most people are discontent. So anybody that is content must have some secret that the rest of us don't have. All of us, I believe, even those of us that find ourselves content at sometimes, still struggle with discontentment. I'm not saying Paul didn't struggle with discontentment, but he says he learned the secret. It's natural to be discontent. I found a poem that illustrates this called Present Tense. It's written in 1989 by a 14-year-old boy. Let me read it to you. It says, "It was spring, but it was summer I wanted, the warm days and the great outdoors. It was summer, but it was fall I wanted, the colorful leaves and the cool, dry air. It was fall, but it was winter I wanted, the beautiful snow and the joy of the holiday season. It was winter, but it was spring I wanted, the warmth and the blossoming of nature. I was a child, but it was adulthood I wanted, the freedom and respect. I was 20, but it was 30 I wanted, to be mature and sophisticated. I was middle-aged, but it was 20 I wanted, the youth and the free spirit. I was retired, but it was middle age I wanted, the presence of mind without limitations. My life was over, and I never got what I wanted." 14-year-old, this just blows me away that a 14-year-old could write that. How are we ever going to be content if all we're ever thinking about is what's coming next, and we never live in the present? What if we stopped asking, what's next? What am I aiming for next? Instead, we just started to grow content with the season that God has placed us in, whether that's the season outside, or that's the season of life that we're in, or the season financially that we're in. What if we just adjusted to that season and let God bless us and speak to us in that season, so we could actually experience the blessings that he is giving us, because he is blessing all of us in different ways. You know, when we in America think about needs, we have a much longer list than the rest of the world. I was listening to a pastor, and he said there's these people somewhere that live in these tents, and he's been going to, it's near Israel, but he'd go to Israel, and so he would see these people that lived in tents. I think they're called the Bodwin people, or the Bedouin people, and he would go and he would see them, and they lived in these tents. That's what they were known for. But he said the last time he went, one of the guys was setting up an antenna, setting up a TV antenna. He had a TV in his tent. So he said that apparently they've added a TV to their list of needs, and so have many of us. But our list is so much longer than what Paul's list would have been. Let me tell you what Paul's list is in 1 Timothy 6, verse 8. He says this: "But if we have food and clothing and nothing else, with these we will be content." Like, what? Food and clothing? What about health insurance? What about a car? What about a house? What about a big house? What about a second car? What about? He says, if we have food and clothing, with these we will be content. So here's the way I take this passage and bring it to America. Every single one of us has so many things to be thankful for, because God has given us so much more than that. Even if you are in the lowest class in America, you have more than that. Most homeless people have more than that. And Paul would have been able to relate to them. The writer of Hebrews says in Hebrews 13:5, "Keep your life free from the love of money and be content with what you have. For he has said, I will never leave you nor forsake you." So there's the secret. But he says, be content with what you have. So God's given you much more than food and clothing. He says, be content with that. He's not saying that when your car breaks down, you can't go and make a decision about whether you're going to get a new car or a used car. What he's saying is be content with what you have. Don't always be asking what's next. What can I get next? What can I get? What can I get so that I can satisfy this discontentment that's in my soul? The secret of contentment is that God is with you, and he's with you even when you have the 3 to 6 months that Dave Ramsey recommends in your savings, and he's with you when you're in debt because you are in a new season. You didn't adjust quickly enough. He promises to never leave you. Paul says it like this in verse 13. Put up the coffee cup. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. You guys have heard this verse so many times, and this is not what you were thinking this verse meant, most of you. You could say, I can do all this. I can abound. I can be brought low. I can have plenty. I can be hungry through Christ who strengthens me. Paul was self-sufficient, like that big RV that has everything it needs, but only through his relationship with Christ, because he was dependent on Christ. The third thing I want you to see today is that contentment cannot be found apart from a relationship with Jesus. Contentment cannot be found apart from a relationship with Jesus. Contentment cannot be found through Stoicism. Contentment cannot be found through minimalism. Contentment cannot be found through materialism. Contentment can only be found through a relationship with Jesus Christ. This is the secret. When we focus on Christ and what he wants for us, we receive a whole new outlook on life. Instead of life being about amassing things and things that we can't take with us, it becomes about our relationship with Jesus Christ. And I want to acknowledge that some of you may be going through some hard times right now. Some of you may be going through a time when you just got laid off from work. Some of you may have got fired. Some of you may have kids entering college. You have different things going on. Some of you may be dealing with a spouse that just left. You may be just going through some really difficult times. You may have a big, major house repair, car repair, and so you're wondering, how am I going to make it through this? The answer is here. You'll make it through because Christ will strengthen you. So the promise is not that he's going to deliver you. The promise is that he will strengthen you. Paul did not write this passage and then bust out of jail. Paul wrote this passage and was still in jail. And he was still dependent on God. And God was the one meeting his needs while he was stuck in prison. So I want to give us 3 next steps to help us grow in our contentment. First next step is this. Thank God for being your provider. Thank God for being your provider. Paul knew that God was his provider. He was not someone that was angry when the Philippians didn't send the money as soon as he thought they would. And he wasn't one that said, if the Philippians don't send me money, what am I going to do? I'm going to die. He wasn't saying that. He knew God was his provider and that God would provide as God chose. And one of the ways I think that you can do this, first of all, is you pray. But there's a song that I came across this week. I actually came across a while ago in the First 15 app, but it's called Provider by Urban Rescue. And I would encourage you to just learn that song. If you pull it up on YouTube, it'll have the lyrics. Just sing it to God. I've been singing it to God, and it's been this week as I've been preparing for this message, and it's been just a blessing to me just to remind me. It has scripture in there. You could Google some of the verses, and you'll find that there's quotes from the Bible. But it'll encourage you to look to God as your provider. John Piper says this. He says, God is always doing 10,000 things in your life, but you may be aware of 3 of them. So thank God for the 3 things. And maybe he'll make you aware of 4 of them or 5 of them. But start thanking God for what he is doing that you're aware of, and then maybe he'll start showing you the other things that he's doing. But we trust God as our provider. Next step B, avoid the comparison trap. If you don't stop comparing yourself to what God has given to others, you'll never be content. If you are, let's say you have siblings and you're all in different jobs and things, and so God's providing for your siblings by giving them $100,000. He's giving you $50,000. He's giving your other sibling $70,000. God has chosen to provide for each of you in that way. As long as you compare yourself to the others, you're never going to be content. And because God hasn't chosen to provide for you in that way, but he's provided for you more than anybody. And all 3 of those siblings has nothing to complain about because God is providing for all 3. And next step C, adjust to the season you're in. Maybe your kids are just going to college, or maybe you just lost a job, and so maybe it's going to take you 2 months to find a new job, and so in those 2 months, you're going to have to adjust. You're not going to be able to go out to eat every day. You're not going to be able to do all these things, and you can try. You just put everything on your credit card and be in debt. But instead of doing that, what if we just adjust until God brings us into a new season where he's blessing us and we're able to go out to eat again? But let's adjust to the season that we're in so that we can be content and trusting God that even though we're in a lean season right now, that one day he may bring us out of it if he chooses. But until then, we're going to live within the means that he's given us. And then next step D is, I told you I was giving you 3, but I'm giving you 4. But the 4th one is based on this whole sermon series, is this: order a copy of Living by the Book by Howard Hendricks. This is an old book, one that I had to read in seminary, but I've recommended to a lot of people. But what this book does is it talks to you about how you interpret the Bible and how you look at the context and how you look at, what is this, a poem, or is this a narrative, or is this a letter? And so how you interpret that, and it helps you to take your copy cup verses. Maybe you're planning on getting a tattoo this year of a Bible verse. I really want you to study it before you put it on your body for the rest of your life. I'm just saying, let's study the Bible the way that the authors intended it, so that when we read it, we're not just making it say whatever we want. Because when we make the Bible say whatever we want, even a promise, God doesn't promise to bless our interpretation. God promises to bless his word the way that it's supposed to be interpreted. So we need to interpret it correctly. But I want to close with this illustration. Imagine there's a missionary family that just God called them. They went to seminary. They moved from the life they knew in America, and they moved over to the Middle East. And so in order to do that, they needed to start a small business. And so they started a small business, and they got this business going. They start meeting people in this business. And so they start meeting these people. They start inviting them over to their house. And eventually what happens is in their basement, a house church starts. And so they got this house church going, and they're meeting for a couple months, and then the authorities find out. Authorities come in, and they arrest the father. They throw the father in prison, says, renounce your faith, stop trying to convert people, and then we'll let you go. He says, I can't do that. They said, well, then you're going to starve. And so the father stays in prison, and he's starving. 3 weeks later, his dead body is delivered to his family. His family says, and then the authorities say to the family, leave town and never come back. What does this passage mean to that family? What does it mean when it says God will meet all of your needs, and God just allowed your husband or your father to starve to death in prison because he wouldn't renounce his faith? These are questions that we have to wrestle with when we interpret the Bible. We can't just say, oh, this works for me in America. What does this mean for people in difficult situations? Because if it doesn't mean it for them, it doesn't mean it for us. So to that wife, I would say, and to those kids, I would say, Christ will strengthen you to get through this season. This season is maybe one of the most difficult, painful seasons you've ever been through, but Christ will strengthen you even now. But I believe that this story helps us to see that God's promise to meet our needs doesn't mean that we're never going to go hungry. It doesn't mean that we're going to have all the clothes we need or all the food that we think we need. It doesn't mean that. It can't mean that. Because if it means that, it means that God's not faithful to fulfill his promises. So we have to figure out, what does it mean for someone that dies of starvation while following Jesus? So I'm going to quote John Piper, and he says this. He says, what the Bible teaches about God meeting our needs is this: everything will be given to us that we need in order to glorify God most fully, even if it means death. Church, most of us aren't going to face a situation as extreme as that. Most of us aren't going to be faced with hunger that we are going to be in a place where we are going to die from it. But what are you going through right now that you need Christ to strengthen you in? What is that place? What is that area of your life? What is that difficulty that you are going through that you need Christ's strength to help you through it in? Because my challenge for you today as we close, as the musicians come, is that you would go to him and say, God, I need your strength in this. I need your strength to endure this. Help me to do it with joy. Help me to endure the suffering that you have brought my way. Help me to be strengthened as you do it. God, I know you may or may not deliver me from it. You can ask him to deliver you from it, but if he doesn't, trust that he will strengthen you in it. And what I want you to do is, as we sing this last song, I want you you can come forward, you can pray with me, you can pray at the stage, you can pray in your seats, but I want you to take that to God. And let's take this coffee cup verse, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me, and let's take that to God. Let's take that to the bank. And let's say, God, I need your strength in this, whatever it is. I need your strength in my marriage that's falling apart. I need your strength in my finances that I don't know how to manage. God, I need your strength to help me endure this difficult season. And then trust that he will meet those needs. Joel, stand. And as God is directing you to what you should do in this invitation, you can stay in